It's a pleasure to welcome everyone here today to our small conference on Japan's new capitalism, historical roots and current realities, presented by the Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies, which I think is particularly appropriate because Professor Edwin Reischauer served as U.S. ambassador to Japan during the Ikeda administration in Japan, immediately following the security treaty crisis of 1960. And Prime Minister Ikeda was the political forebearer, I think one can definitely say, in some important ways for Prime Minister Kishida, whom we had the honor of hosting here at the Reischauer Center in January, as many of you know. Today, of course, I first and foremost would like to introduce my colleagues in the conference, I think, who present both two of the crucial areas of the new capitalism, and then and deeper insights into those two particularly important sectors. Professor Bill Grimes of the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University is the author of Unmaking the Japanese Miracle. And also, he's a specialist on the political economy of Japanese finance and has another important book from Cornell University Press that you may know, Currency and Contest in East Asia. So he both focuses deeply on Japan itself and then also works comparatively and in terms of regional analysis on East Asia more generally. He's served as a visiting assistant professor at Harvard University, associate dean of the Pardee School, and did his PhD at Princeton University. And he will be speaking, as you probably know from the analysis, on monetary and fiscal policy dimensions of new capitalism. Our second outside speaker, outside, I say that just definitively, we're proud that she's also a SAIS alum, but who has done an extraordinary job of research on Japanese energy issues. She's currently assistant professor of energy and sustainability at Mason University here in the Washington area. And she has, I hope that she'll give us some elaboration. She has a new book that relates very closely to our broader theme of Japan's new capitalism. Her new book is called Building Resilient Energy Systems, Lessons from Japan, that just came out. It's a 2023 book. And then finally, as our commentator, we have Dr. Kotaro Shiojiri, who many of you know because he has he is teaching this year at SAIS as a lecturer and also as a visiting scholar of the Reischauer Center for International Studies here. He had a very distinguished career as a government official prior to joining SAIS. He was chief of staff to Ambassador Kenichiro Sasai, who was Japanese ambassador to the United States, and also worked as a key staff person on both G20 summits and also G7 summits in Japan, which, of course, global summit diplomacy is the subject on which he has been teaching at SAIS. And so he's going to serve as our commentator today. But just in advance, let me say just a few words by way of setting the stage for today's discussion. To say a word or two about the historical context of the new capitalism that Prime Minister Kishida announced, I believe, around October of 2022, not long after he became Prime Minister of Japan. In his various pronouncements and elaborations on that concept, he stressed two dimensions: economic growth, particularly through stimulating innovation in Japan, and then secondly, distribution, broader distribution of resources, raising wages for groups that had, in a sense, been discriminated against by the market or by the neoliberal policies of the two previous administrations. As many of you know, coming at the early part of this century, between 2001, 2006, Prime Minister Koizumi, and then the long period of leadership by Prime Minister Abe from 2012, late in 2012 to 2019, the strong emphasis was on market liberalization and deregulation, freeing the market. And the Kishida approach, I think it's fair to say, and of course many people see the Kishida heritage as the continuation of Prime Minister Abe's heritage. But the question that really we are debating today is whether to see this as a continuation or as a distinct set of policies that really are a throwback to an earlier era, particularly the era of Prime Minister Hayato Ikeda, who first was METI minister in Japan under Prime Minister Kishi, but with a distinctive set of policies, 1957, 58 to 1960, the security treaty crisis, when, as many of you know, finally, in the wake of that crisis, in the midst of that crisis, Prime Minister Kishi resigned, and then Ikeda Hayato became Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister Kishi, of course, was the grandfather of recent Prime Minister Abe. So there is a question as to whether recent policies by the Kishida administration, we're really only considering the economic side of this, although we do have a Q&A, and I think to keep things coherent, we want to focus on the substance of this, which of course is the new capitalism. It's the economic policies. But the broader question of whether we have a throwback set of policies or whether we have a continuation of previous policies from the Abe and Koizumi years. Now, to start a discussion of that, I think it's valuable to recall some of the elements of Ikeda's policies themselves, both as METI, Minister of Trade and Industry of Japan, under the Kishi government, and then as Prime Minister himself when he succeeded Prime Minister Kishi in the fall of 1960. And I think in looking at his policies, and these actually, I've been especially interested in this because this relates to the work that I did in my book, Crisis and Compensation, that some of you know about, the logic of the LDP, Liberal Democratic Party, remaining in power in Japan from Princeton University Press. It's long ago, back in 1988. But this period, certainly surrounding the security treaty crisis, is one of the historic periods in the evolution of Japanese public policy. And it did involve some significant shifts that in some ways, to my mind, are strikingly parallel to what we have seen recently in Kishida's new Capitalism. Let me just recapitulate a few dimensions of that. First of all, the emphasis on policies stimulating economic growth. Japan, as Prime Minister Kishi came to power in 1957, was coming out of the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. And after that, of course, some important economic shocks that it ultimately turned into opportunities for economic growth, particularly the Suez Crisis of 1956. In 56, of course, the British and the French attacked after Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. The British and the French and Israel intervened in Egypt. And the subsequent fighting, of course, closed the Suez Canal, a major trade route for the world, but what this did for Japan was to greatly stimulate demand for shipping capacity. Of course, it created confusion in international energy markets and so on, which was to Japan's disadvantage. But then it began to stimulate the opportunities in shipping and shipbuilding, particularly at a time when Japan was just beginning to develop its complex of industries related to that, such as the steel industry, of course, had begun to grow in the wake of the Korean War previously, but the economy was beginning to move after the period of great uncertainty after World War II. And in the midst of all of this, the trade minister of Japan, Ikeda Hayato, announced a plan to double Japanese income by 1970, I guess it was. But actually, of course, Japan greatly outdid that, giving this sort of a benchmark, which seemed optimistic at the time, led to very rapid rates of capital investment in Japan that worked ahead of the market, increased particularly export capabilities in areas like shipbuilding, which, given also the timing in the wake of the Suez Crisis and the growth of world shipping, including also, of course, Japan's own energy imports from the Gulf, which also began to rise rapidly in this period. This benchmark policy of the income doubling plan and the massive infrastructure capital investment that occurred in its aftermath began to drive the Japanese economy forward at double-digit rates. That continued, except for the recession in 1965, that continued right through the oil shock of 1973, and then even at a reduced rate, but significantly right on into the 1980s, up until the collapse of the bubble in 1990. So this was the beginning of an extraordinary period of economic growth, stimulated not by exports in the first instance, but really by capital investment, domestic capital investment in Japan. Of course, as economic growth tends to do, this began also to create pressures for social change. The urbanization accelerated in Japan. And a new middle class began to evolve, which was rather diffident about the set of policies, rather conservative policies that the Japanese government had introduced. The new middle class and white-collar people tended to be critical of the Liberal Democratic Party, and income inequalities as well were rising. And in the midst of this, the Kishi administration which of course had conservative origins that dated from, some of them from before World War II, because she had been the industrial director in Manchuria before World War II. Of course, in the reforms and the transformation, he was playing a new role and was also quite close to the United States and supported the revision of the Security Treaty in 1960. But his policies were controversial, a new police bill, then the revision of the Security Treaty itself, which actually, ironically, was more favorable to Japan than the previous one that had been done under the shadow of the occupation. And yet, this range of groups, many of them disaffected as a result of the change, or members of the academic community, and of course, there was also a unification of the Socialist Party of Japan just before this 1960. This led to these demonstrations. And finally, the cancellation of Eisenhower's visit to Japan in 1960, and then to the coming of Ikeda Hayato, who had had such a strong economically based set of policies as prime minister in July of 1960. Ikeda continued on until after the Tokyo Olympics of 1964, and his period as prime minister, while continuing the high growth economic policies, also added another important dimension that we arguably also is analogous to some of the interests of the Kishida administration today, namely distribution, broader distribution. In my book, I was presenting this as compensation for groups that were skeptical of the ruling party, but were swing constituencies inside Japan, particularly agriculture and small business. Ikeda introduced the Nogyo Kihonho, the basic agricultural law, which provided significantly greater subsidies through agricultural cooperatives to the countryside in Japan, whose income, of course, hadn't been expanding as rapidly as that of the cities after doing extremely well in the early post-war period. And then also introduced the Chusho Kigyo Kihonho, the small business basic law, which also provided for support policies for small businesses in Japan. Of course, as I'm sure Professor Grimes and some of our other presenters will mention later, the system, both the financial and the political system that supported these sets of policies, which turned out to have been quite successful in both stabilizing conservative rule in Japan and also in upgrading these sectors. In the case of agriculture, it was mostly a matter of sustaining a declining sector with larger and larger subsidies, which continued to be very large until the 70s. But again, new agricultural equipment, more use of fertilizer, upgraded the sorts of products that Japanese agriculture produced. Its productivity, given that it's fundamentally not a country, it's a heavily populated country without a lot of agricultural land, but the policies did upgrade the productivity of agriculture in Japan. In the case of small business, again, it was a politically driven set of policies to create support among small business, but it also help to upgrade the capabilities of small businesses. Many of you know, small businesses in Japan have includes both the distribution sector, which has not been so efficient, but also a manufacturing sector that, together with Japan's largest companies, in terms of supply chains has become an important part of the competitive success of Japanese industry. In the auto industry, for example, the support policies were helpful in creating what became formidable Japanese competitiveness in automobiles by the 1970s. So distribution, yes, but also attempting to promote growth by increasing competitiveness and by innovation. But within the industrial groups themselves, rather than through startups and the sort of thing that Silicon Valley has been doing. So in short, growth and distribution as the hallmarks of the Ikeda policies. And the question that we have is before us is really how the policies today of the Kishida administration relate to those of the Ikeda, the previous Ikeda administration. Certainly, in many ways, the political logic for a distinct set of policies is there. Ikeda himself, or rather Kishida, is the leader of the Kochikai, the political faction that really is the descendant of Ikeda himself, in contrast to the political line coming from Kishi all the way through Abe. That was a more, on foreign policy, a more conservative line, and on economic policy, in the early days, arguably quite a statist set of policies under Kishi, who himself had been vice minister of the trade ministry. But then the Kishida, so what are the relationship of all of these, and what does this ultimately mean for Japan's economic and political future? These are the questions that we would like to introduce. So as our next speaker, we have Professor Bill Grimes on monetary and fiscal policy dimensions of new capitalism. Bill, thank you.
There's a clicker. Great. Thank you. Thank you for coming here. So I'm not going to talk much about history. I'm going to focus on current day and the future. The future, of course, is impossible to know, but I'm going to go ahead and do that anyway. So first off, so Kent has asked me to talk about the monetary and fiscal policies dimensions of the new capitalism. And so before we do this, I think it might be good to just quickly encapsulate what the new capitalism is. And it's a little fuzzy still, I think, in some ways, and very specific in other ways. So there is a policy document that came out in June called the Grand Design and Action Plan for a New Form of Capitalism. And subsequently, there was the creation of a council, which is called in English the Council for the New Form of Capitalism Realization. And that council has not been coming out with a lot of new reports, but, whoops, I'm still in the right place. All right. But it has been, but members of the council have spoken, and it all seems to sort of fit into a series of things. And so what I've done here is, rather than try to recapitulate the 50-plus page report on the Grand Design and Action Plan, is to focus on a couple of the pieces that seem to be distinctive or not distinctive about it. And so if you look at the policy document, there are things that could have been published at any point in the last 50 years, but not all of them by any means. And so, and we are seeing also a significant shift away in some ways intellectually, as Professor Calder has pointed out, from some of the assumptions of Abenomics. And here I want to focus on these 2 points about investment and stakeholder capitalism. So as we all know, Abenomics was the three arrows, and one was loose monetary policy initially, and the other was flexible and fiscal policy, starting with stimulus and then consolidation, and then you had the third arrow, which was structural, the meat of Abenomics was really saying that through a series of these structural changes that we can shift Japanese supply side to be more efficient, more growth-oriented, and the fiscal and monetary policy are meant to sort of support demand until that has the effect that you need, because supply side policies are always going to, if they're going to create more growth, they're also going to do so by creating disruption. Right, and so you'll have certain sectors that are going to lose people, and that are going to where you're going to shift investment from one place to another, labor from one place to another. People have to get trained up. You have to create new sources of demand for the supply, and so the idea was primarily, like if you think about it logically, it's a deregulation effort that was meant to transform Japan's supply side into something that looks more like a economics textbook. Okay, where there's more market forces, fewer disruptions, more incentives for people to make money, whether it's tax or other things, and then the demand will, in the short term you have to manage it, but in the long run the demand will manage itself, and so that. The Kishida approach, the new form of capitalism, which obviously it's not a new form of capitalism. It's I think they just couldn't come up with a name, I assume, and I mean they could have called it new stakeholder capitalism. They could have called it new compassionate economy. But I think whatever happened, they didn't come up with a name, and they come up with a new form of capitalism, which we all know is kind of a nonsense word. But it doesn't mean that it's a nonsense concept or a nonsense set of policies. So we keep some of the Abenomics story, but looking at the supply side, the Kishida version, the new form of capitalism, calls for much more direct government involvement in that supply side, on the one hand, and then a shift towards re-emphasizing stakeholders outside of shareholders on the private sector side. So I think that some of these are quite interesting. I'm going to focus on the government side because I was asked to, and I think I have a little more experience on this as well. But on the return to stakeholder capitalism, there's been a lot of jawboning about wage increases, which is important. Japanese government policy is supporting wage increases in a number of ways, including minimum wage. But there's talk in the long document about philanthropy and impact investing. Again, these are the things that we're kind of hoping that people will go along with it. And really, there is this the public piece with public-private cooperation, which I'll get back to. But if we think about the fiscal piece of it, right, the big story is about investment. So I'll start with fiscal, which is going to be almost all of what I do today, and think about what does this actually mean. So again, this is primarily a microeconomic story. The tools that we have are fairly limited, and when we look at the role of macro policy, there are these 4 points that I want to touch on. So first off, there's a lot in the new capitalism story that's about redistribution, and here it's important to note that the Japanese fiscal policy is highly redistributive already. When you look at the overall, all of the money that comes in, all the money that goes out, it's highly redistributive in the form of pensions and medical. And so that's not the strategic goal that's enunciated in New Capitalism. In New Capitalism, the strategic goal is about growth, not about pure redistribution. I mean, so it's trying to shift away from the redistribution that's just about shifting who consumes to redistributing resources to ways that will support the changes in the economy. So that would be, investment in human capital, and there's a lot of discussion of human capital, and also in, I think it should be. I think it's not as plain as it should be in the policies, but towards support for labor mobility, right? So one of the things that Abenomics did was it tried to allow for greater labor mobility and greater flexibility on the corporate side. But the problem is that if I lose my job or I want to change my job, you have limited unemployment. There's not that much job training support. If you go on the Japanese subways, you'll see more and more all the ads are for relocation services and job services, but the secondary job market in Japan is still fairly limited. And so those are the kinds of investments, or the kinds of redistribution that will have a supply side effect. But in order to do so, you need to find fiscal space. And here, I think it's really important to ask ourselves, how do you find fiscal space, right? And there's a limited number of ways. So you can borrow more, right? That may be limited. Okay, so if you can't borrow more, then the only ways that you gain fiscal space are by shifting the allocations within the budget or by increasing the revenues. And increasing the revenues, it can be done either by raising taxes, problem, or by raising economic growth. And like everybody, they prefer the idea of raising economic growth. And this is what Professor Calder was talking about with regard to the politics of productivity story that you had in the 1960s. That in order to support the growing sectors, you compensate the losers. And that's been a long tradition in Japan, but it gets harder and harder as growth drops. So this requires macro policy to deal with demand management, right? And that has been one of the main things that we've seen from Japanese fiscal policy for the last 30 years, right? Is support for demand through government spending, and in some cases through tax cuts. And that's a problem, because then we get back to our friend the borrowing problem, right? Okay, and then the last thing that governments do is so this is intertemporal transfers, and this is just saying basically at a time when when the bulk of the budget is made up of transfers to older citizens, to somehow shift that curve a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to I just put these up here because they were in the report, and they kind of say what they're planning to do on the fiscal policy side. I guess I could read them out loud, but I'm going to summarize them as Abenomics. It's exactly like you could have almost taken it word for word from the Abe thing about fiscal stimulus for short-term growth to fiscal consolidation in the long term. So there's no, I mean, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, right? That it was reasonable before. It remains something that's in there. Japan has not yet cracked the problem of how do you have sufficient demand without the government issuing new debt and doing a lot of spending on behalf of the citizens. Okay, so with that, I'm going to show you some pictures. I mean, so honestly, the meat of it is the uninteresting slides with words on it, but it's also useful to look at some pictures that I think will make a little clearer why we see some challenges, and then I'll come back to what the policy tools are looking at the end. So the fiscal starting point, I think this may be a little hard to read, but basically the pictures show that you have, Japan has high debt, right? And in recent years, it was sort of slowing its bond issuance. There's a little bit of a problem called COVID that complicated the world, but they're sort of back on the track of this. But making slow movements if we look at, this is just international comparisons, and they basically all just show that Japan has high debt, right? Nobody's surprised by this. I should say here, I'm not a debt doomsayer. I follow the general economic assumption that debt is a problem if you can't pay it back. That many of us have debt. There's good debt and there's bad debt, right? So I have a mortgage. That's I don't really like having a mortgage, but it's a reasonable debt, right? I'm paying for an investment and the ability to have a roof over my head. And so as long as you're able to pay back, debt doesn't turn into trouble. And so there's, the normal way of looking at it is the interest rate greater than the growth rate. Is the interest rate of debt greater than the growth rate of government revenue, which probably ends up looking like the growth rate of the economy over a longer period of time. So I'm not saying there's an emergency. I'm just saying that that we don't have infinite headroom, probably. And I'll get back to a slide that looks at this, G versus R thing towards the end that will just, make a point about changing interest rates. But this is unbearably ugly, but I did want to use the most up-to-date one of these things. So basically what this shows is the general account expenditure and general account revenue. And general account revenue is, I'm going to have to look at my thing because it's not actually readable on that, is it? It's about 36% of revenue is bond issuance at the moment. Is that right? Sorry. Old eyes. About 39% of bond issuance. That one is 31%, and then there's the other sources. And it had gotten over 50%, so this is looking better, right? They're kind of moving in the right direction. But the other thing to look at is general account expenditures. And this is what Japanese Ministry of Finance bureaucrats like to refer to as budget rigidity. And budget rigidity is just the following. There are some things you don't have a choice. Now, I understand that I'm in Washington at a time when there are people in Congress who think they can blow up the debt ceiling and therefore you don't have to pay back your debts. But I'm here to tell you have to pay back your debts. So this thing here is you got to pay back your debts. That's just done, right? This is this thing here, which is the biggest part, is Social Security of various sorts. This thing here, this dark blue one there, is something called the local allocation tax, which is tax transfers to prefectures and localities. It's done by a formula. Functionally, if the central government stopped paying this, then somebody else would end up in debt, right? So it's just a transfer. And so you end up with this pretty small space of what's called discretionary spending. And discretionary spending is not purely discretionary. You don't have the option of like firing your military all at once, right? You don't have the option of, no longer having public schools, right? So even in that, you can only compress it in various ways. And we know that there's also been discussion of increasing military spending, which is about 6% of the budget. Even if they don't get up to doubling it, it's still going to be a lot, right? So the question then is raised, is like, if we're thinking about this in terms of transfers in one way or another, do we have fiscal space? And here we go. This is yeah, this is a little hard to see from where I am. Normally you have my own computer for this reason, but my eyes are old. This is not your fault. So what we see is that that Japan actually is very low at the moment in non-social security expenditure, extremely low according to compared to other OECD countries, and not extremely high, but pretty high on Social Security, and that one's only going to go up and up and up. But this is the one that always gives people like me hope, is, oh yeah, Japan's undertaxed. Like, they just don't, the government doesn't absorb that much. So you just increase tax revenues and you should be fine. Sorry. Here's the challenge of that, though. And I'm sorry, I'm turning into more of a pessimist than I did. The last slide, I tell you, I'll sound better, I'll sound nicer. So there's 2 points that I want to make on this. One is this dark line here. This is a potential growth, right? And this is it's a somewhat controversial calculation that's made by macroeconomic planners, and they say, what do we think the economy could be growing at if everything is sort of going right? But there's not much question that it's going down, right? And we go from in the sort of 4s in the 1980s over time down to roughly 0, not quite 0, right? Like it's probably more like 0.5 to 1.5%, depends on who you're talking about, and there's different ways that we compose this, but it's really being driven, the decline is being driven by 2 things primarily. One is labor, which is hours worked is in decline, which is largely a result of declining working age population. That's not changing rapidly. And secondarily, of a reduction in capital investment. But one of the reasons why we see a reduction in capital investment, or a reduction in net capital investment, I should say, is that returns on capital investment in Japan are pretty poor. And again, you could see the direction of this line looks the same whether you're doing output gap or capital investment, or frankly, working age population. So the only things that we're playing with at the moment, right, are improved total factor productivity, which is exactly what supply side is about capital stock, but only if you can figure out a way to make money. And I guess you could get a little bit with hours worked by having that only gets you so far, right? Like Japan already has a higher percentage of women in the labor force than the United States, for example. Not widely recognized, maybe not fully utilized, but there's only so much space on these things. And so really what we're betting on is some sort of demand and some sort of total factor productivity growth. And this is the one that I kind of gestured to this earlier, and this is that every time Japan has a tax hike, you see a drop in growth. And this is simply the point that I made at the beginning, or I said at the beginning, and this is just a little proof that I wasn't lying to you, that the Japanese demand still requires government support. And so, how one of the ways in which government is supporting the economy is through these transfer payments, mostly to older people at the moment, and through certain employment opportunities. So let me just, I mentioned interest rates. So I was told to do fiscal and monetary. There is no monetary policy particularly associated with the new capitalism, unlike Abenomics, which is a big bazooka, quantitative easing, QQE. But the question has always, and I'm not going to predict monetary policy, and I'm not going to have strong expectations about what the long-term interest rate is. I don't think it's going to be super high, but the main point is that one of the things that makes the government debt sustainable is the fact that interest rates are low. And luckily, I think there's no real reason to expect that interest rates are going to get really high. It's just that they're going to be, they've gotten a bit higher than they were. Let me just wrap this up because I think I'm at the end of my time. I didn't think to put on a timer, but I'm wearing a watch. So here's what, in order to make this thing work, right? What is it that we want to have happen at the fiscal level? And so if we think about the political tasks, one of them is reducing the magnitude of age-based redistribution. That's hard. I'm just going to go out and say it. That's a difficult thing to do. If you look at Japanese people of voting age, right now I think the percentage of people over the age of 65, which is the national pension age, is about 36%. If you add in people, who are like, I hate to say it, my age, who are going to be retiring in less, who are going to be, I'm not going to be retiring, I'm a 10-year faculty member, but who are going to be hitting 65 in less than 10 years, then, and then you change, and then you look at the way that people actually vote, what you're going to find is that 50% plus of the electorate in any given election is within 5 to 10 years of retirement if they're not already retired. Older people vote more, even people like me who have jobs vote more, young people, you guys should vote, but you don't. And so this is a real political challenge, no question. There's also the challenge of figuring out how to reduce the reliance on fiscal stimulus. And this is simply a continuation of the bet made in Abenomics. And I don't disagree with this. I want to emphasize this, that you stimulate the economy as a transitional measure to try to improve the supply side of it. But and then hopefully you as you get growth. So it's really a bet on growth. And I want to to briefly talk about policy tools. I mostly focused on central government spending, right? On the money that the government is putting into investment. And this was going back to the Ikeda plan. There was high levels of government investment, and some of it was in the form of government spending. Some of it was in the form of something called FILP. So I've shown you the picture on government spending. But FILP was an important thing, the Fiscal Investment and Loan Program, in the 1960s. Here's the problem, FILP no longer exists. It was an enormous amount of money, potentially. They called it Japan's second budget. It was about 70% of the size of the central government budget, not small. It was all focused on, traditionally had been focused on infrastructure. We're in a post-FILP world where wherein the government had captive sources of borrowing, postal savings, pension service, et cetera, that was dedicated to state-chosen projects. And that leaves us really, that's why there's so much of an insistence almost on the importance of PPPs, of public-private partnerships. And this is always a challenge to make these things work well. They work very well for certain specific types of projects. But really what the Japanese government is in the business of at this point in terms of the new capitalism is going to have to be more efforts to try to shift private spending. What we find is that private companies are particularly interested in public spending when they're failing. I'm not saying this is impossible, but it is an important task, and I think they've wisely chosen, green and digital as places where there's opportunities for growth. So the last point I just want to make is, okay, I sound like a downer, I know. I feel bad, but it's still important. All of these things are important because this is, Japan needs to build growth. Japan needs to make these transitions. And very, very importantly, rethinking social support systems. The way that redistribution works in Japan is just like everywhere else. It's an ongoing issue. It should be thought of regularly. And this just puts a finer point on it. Second is I'm kind of suggesting that if you look at the macro level, the impact is going to be relatively smallish. But at the margin, these things can be quite important. And I think that our next speaker is going to talk about how at project levels you can have a really big impact. And that these don't necessarily, they accumulate out to macroeconomic effects, but really they can have important effects that are beyond macroeconomic, changing an energy mix, making the economy more resilient in various ways, making people's lives better. And then finally, honestly, you need to have some sort of motivator. So Gershon Kron called it ideology. Other people call it mobilization. Something that unifies, that gives a rationale for the strategy that's done, even if a lot of it ends up, looking like things we've seen before on the fiscal side. And I'll leave I have ideas on some of the other pieces like stakeholder, but I'm pretty sure I'm done on time. So what happens next? Do we have a break now?
I think maybe, given that you have presented all of this, if people have specific questions about what I spoke about, even particularly about what President Frank said, you might take one or two, and then have a brief break.
Okay, please.
Thank you so much, Professor. I'm really interested in this topic, and throughout what you said, I found a lot of things in Abe's reform or supply side reform is not that dissimilar with what Xi Jinping has been trying to do in China, which is also supply side reform and tackling similar questions. So my question. Thank you. So my question is, throughout your presentation on this new capitalism, how will Japan try to fix some long-term criticism on its economic policies, such as the overuse of informal contract workers versus formal employment, and squeezing small suppliers upstream in order to help the downstream big corporations? Thank you so much.
So those are good questions. It's a little outside of the fiscal piece, but fair enough. So I think one of the big questions is how you manage the labor end. And in Japan, as in many other places, there's been a rise in contingent labor. Basically, the more fixed you have the one section of the labor, the more contingency you'll have on the other. And working in a university, I think we see that even in American universities. But there are a variety of ways of doing it. But this is universal, right? And in East Asia, it's quite common as well, particularly among the places that had lifetime employment, which is basically Japan and Korea. So I guess I'm not talking about a lot of places, but you see similar forces happening in Europe. If you're going to do the Abenomics approach of trying to increase labor mobility and trying to redeploy labor out of unproductive areas into more productive areas, then you probably need to have social support, unemployment insurance, relocation opportunities, incentives for human capital development, et cetera. And those are all, they're in the literature, right? They're in the intentions, but actually carrying them out is difficult. And Japan has made a lot of efforts. And by Japan, I mean not just government, but very much private sector too. As I was saying, you see these things on the subways all the time, and people giving these happy stories about finding the jobs they love. But large-scale social change is different, is difficult. Now, the other question, the bigger question really is about wages, I think. And that is, how do we increase the money that goes to labor? And there, I think Japan's been a little timid in terms of minimum wage, for example. So the Japanese minimum wage right now is roughly the same as the American federal minimum wage. This is probably half of what it is in DC. It's half of what it is in Massachusetts. I can say $7.25 an hour. And they've been moving it up incrementally. And of course, it doesn't make sense to do it just by exchange rate. But there are ways to try to push this harder. But the big thing is to increase profitability of companies, which is the plan. That's what would make it sustainable. I don't know whether that's possible.
I think maybe if we could take the two questions together and very briefly.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Real quickly. Thank you. And what role do you think in fiscal policy, trying to tie fiscal policy, increasing markets through new trade agreements is playing in the Japan government thinking? What brings it to mind is Japan moving for Korea to be added to the G7. What sort of strategy how do you think that aspect is forming new coalitions, economic coalitions internationally, is playing in the fiscal policy as a growth element? Thank you.
And did you say there's one other one? Is there another question?
Yes, thank you so much. I know you said you can't predict the future and only time can tell, but I was wondering if you can let us know certain aspects of that we can look into to kind of keep an eye on to see the progress of Kishida's new capitalism. Thank you.
So on trade agreements don't have a big effect on growth. And they don't have like a large, especially for a large open economy like Japan, it's not going to have a big effect on GDP. It will have big effects on certain groups. Within Japan, and the Abenomics story also, I think, was not primarily about trade agreements. It was primarily about using trade agreements as a way of liberalizing the domestic economy, and then secondary, and also of shoring up alliances and friendships. So I think that's actually the place to look in this case as well. So one of the pieces that I didn't mention in here, because once you have a lot of items on, people want to put even more on because then you're getting excluded. So economic security was in there. So building up a better friend shoring capability, building up better relationships, locking in new types of supply chains is a goal, and trade agreements can help to facilitate that. On the progress report, I think what we would look for is are we seeing investment in new areas that are areas of growth? Are we seeing real redeployments of labor in those directions? That'll take longer. Are we seeing higher returns from investments in things like energy and digitification? Those are, I guess, the places you would look. But the problem of any supply side oriented policy is that you really can't track the progress in any way that's rigorous, because you don't know how long it'll take. You don't know. So that's a bad answer, I know, but it's a true answer.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Bill. We appreciate that. Now, but we do have some coffee in the other room, and Professor Sklarew will be setting up. So we won't have a large break, but if you would like some coffee and maybe go and get it and come back in. We'll start in about
Oh, there's no screen. I thought there was going to be.
So
Oh, there, so I can look there.
unfortunately, yeah.
Okay, and that's okay. I may have to put my glasses on to see my own slides. That's
Yeah,
okay.
I apologize, but hey, this is your clicker.
And sorry, I'm going to be really
no.
low tech about this. Which one do I post to go forward and back? So is this
I'm
forward
gonna
or is this forward?
I'm gonna take a guess and pick one of the side buttons, but I actually haven't used the system before, so you may just want to press.
Yep.
Is that right?
Okay.
And then
Yep,
back.
there we go.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Question answered, okay.
I guess that's it's a little 5 out of 10 pages. It's a little bit Well, I'm glad that we did have some very interesting questions. I should just mention that we will have time at the end, and hopefully that will give a chance for a general examination of some of the issues about new capitalism that we've discussed here. As our next speaker, I think I mentioned this at the beginning, an alum who has done many things in the broader world since and teaches at George Mason University, but who's back again at SAIS. So, and with a new book actually too. So Jennifer, it's a pleasure to see you here. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back at my alma mater for this discussion. As Dr. Calder alluded to, before going back to academia, I was working for Donen for a little while, that's so Japanese nuclear background. And then I also worked for the U.S. Department of Commerce in the Office of Japan on electricity deregulation. So a lot of what you'll hear today comes from that experience, my past experience. Sorry, I'm trying to put my water down somewhere where it won't spill. But to talk about new departures in Japanese energy policy, we actually need to look to the past first. So if we talk about Japan's energy system narrative, we can look at the lenses of new capitalism, and we can also look at the lens of resilience priorities. And that's actually the focus of my book, the resilience priorities side. So resilience priorities of different stakeholders in energy policy making. So bureaucrats, politicians, regulators, utility companies, and the public. And we can take both of those lenses of new capitalism and resilience priorities and apply those to energy system drivers and goals in these different past periods leading up to this idea of new capitalism, and we'll see it echoed throughout these other periods. So we'll look at the 1970s oil crises, we'll look at the 1990s to 2000s emergence of climate change on the global agenda, we'll look at the 2011 Fukushima disaster, and we'll also look at the pandemic that started in 2020 and the war in Ukraine that began in 2022. So we'll take all of that and apply it to Japan's energy policy in the new capitalism context, and we'll look specifically at the green transformation GX strategy, which was mentioned in Professor Grimes' presentation briefly as well. So in order to talk about new capitalism and resilience priorities, we need to define both. So we heard a lot about new capitalism in the previous two presentations, but I wanted to focus specifically on three elements as they apply to energy policy. One is eliminating distribution blockages. The second is overcoming underinvestment in new value-added sectors. And the third is promoting diversity. So let's segue now to the resilience priorities discussion briefly. We have to consider what type of resilience we're talking about when we think about these different stakeholder groups and what they think about when they are considering resilience of Japan's energy system. And we have several different categories of resilience that these groups might be considering, and we'll talk about each of these in those different periods I mentioned. So one is engineering resilience, and this is kind of the traditional definition of resilience, going back to prior operations, recovering from a shock, and the system returns to the operations that it was able to handle before in terms of infrastructure. That definition was the original definition, but that kind of segued into a definition of ecological resilience that includes the concept of system adaptation. So we're not returning to our prior system completely, we're adapting. So we have system adaptation, and that can include variability, diversity, sustainability, and redundancy. And you can start to see, for those of you who are familiar with Japan's energy system, where those features started to come in after the oil crises. We also have this concept of social resilience, and that includes resource availability, resource accessibility, so do different populations within a country or within a place all have access to those resources and to that electricity. Acceptability, so does that community accept the use of those resources? And we can start to see where that might have changed after the Fukushima disaster, right? And then quality of life. We can also combine ecological resilience and social resilience and look at it as socio-ecological resilience. Sorry for the chameleon, it was the only image I could think of because they adapt. So anyway, we're combining ecological and social resilience, and so the features that we pull together are system adaptation, right, from ecological resilience, but also stakeholder learning, which sort of bridges the two, and then well-being. And finally, we have economic resilience. And economic resilience can include economic loss or gain and affordability of energy resources or electricity. And these don't have to be disparate, but we will see how they integrate or synthesize or differ and cause conflict across these different periods. So we'll take a look at some different periods. So if we look at the post-oil crises period, 1970s through 1980s, we have broad cooperation across all of these different stakeholder groups in terms of resilience priorities. Everybody is focused on engineering resilience. Can we continue to use our existing oil infrastructure? How do we make it more resilient? Building stockpiles and shifting supply sources, et cetera. So trying to make that infrastructure more resilient. And then socio-ecological resilience was also prominent. So everyone was focused on diversifying sources of supply for oil, but also transitioning away from the use of oil in the electricity supply, and that moved towards nuclear power and coal at the time. And then finally, economics. Everybody was concerned across the board, all of those stakeholders, about price of oil and also the implications of that oil price for electricity prices. So what did that mean for the economic goals at the time? Well, it translated to eliminating distribution blockages, promoting investment in new sectors, and promoting diversity. This should look familiar because it is also the same three features of new capitalism that I just had on the previous slide. So not new, as we've heard already, but new explanations and applications for those same features, right? So we'll see how the iterations change over time. But what happened in this period was we had the elimination of distribution blockages translate into energy policy initiatives that included addressing oil supply chain challenges, securing a baseload for electricity supply, different baseload than oil, right? And resource and electricity pricing modifications. In terms of promoting investment in new sectors, we had nuclear power and fuel cycle development, so the back end of the fuel cycle, reprocessing and reuse, emerging, right, to make that system more resilient. Energy efficient technologies, emergence of investment in energy efficient technologies, and to mitigate demand, right, so that we need less supply of energy because we're mitigating the demand side, so therefore need less oil. And finally, siting subsidies, so emerging siting